So, here's something worth thinking about as you settle in tonight. Say these words to yourself, softly, without really moving your lips. Davy Jones's Locker. You already know what they mean. Nobody sat you down and taught you that. There was no lesson, no moment you can point to. The phrase simply arrived at some point in your life, the way old C words do, and it settled somewhere near the back of your mind. And it has been resting there quietly ever since, waiting for a night like this one. So tonight, we are going to take it out and turn it over slowly. We are going to follow one small scrap of sailor slang across 300 years, from the wet deck of a leaking ship to the very bottom of the sea. And if you drift off somewhere along the way, that is perfectly fine. The story will still be here in the morning. You do not have to reach the end of it. Nothing in it needs you awake. So let's start where the story actually starts, which turns out to be a strange place to stand, because nobody is quite sure where that is. Here is the odd thing about Davy Jones. He has no birthday, no first sighting, no single sailor who stood on a deck one night, pointed at something moving in the dark water, and gave it a name that stuck. The name was already old by the time anyone bothered to write it down. It was already worn smooth from handling. And that is unusual, even for folklore. A legend usually leaves a trail. So where is his? Who first said the name? And where and in what year? You can look, and the honest answer is that nobody knows. You can often find the first teller of a legend, or the first village, or the first printed page. With Davy Jones, you find only the middle of the story. He walks into the written record fully formed. He arrives with a name and a reputation and a locker of his own. And the men writing about him talk as though you must already know exactly who he is, because they assumed you did. He was common knowledge. He was the kind of thing every sailor understood, and nobody ever explained. The way you understand what a shadow is without ever needing to define one. And that is because Davy Jones was never really a written thing to begin with. He was a spoken thing. He lived in the mouths of men who could not, for the most part, read or write. The sea kept no diary. Sailors did not sit down at the end of a hard watch and record their expressions for posterity. They just used them. They passed them from one crew to the next, from an old hand to a frightened boy on his first voyage, and the words changed a little each time, the way spoken things always do. So the true beginning is genuinely lost. It went down with the men who knew it, which means this whole story is a detective story with no confession at the end. There is no final page where someone admits who Davy Jones really was. And honestly, for tonight, that is the best kind of story there is. There is nothing to solve. There is nothing to get right. You can just follow the clues as far as they go, and then let them go. So let me tell you how we are going to do this. First, we are going to meet the two men who first wrote him down more than 250 years ago. One of them barely mentions him. The other paints him so vividly that the picture has stuck to sailors ever since. Then we are going to look at the 5 old stories people have told about where his name came from. A pub landlord, a drowned prophet, a word carried home from the Caribbean, a clumsy sailor, and a saint. None of them proven, all of them worth turning over. And then, once we have his name, we are going to open his locker. We are going to find out what it actually was, what it came to mean, and how a place at the bottom of the sea became a kind of address that every sailor understood. After that, we will drift outward, gently, into the wider world he belongs to. His ship, if he had one. The ceremony where he still appears, the strange blue fire that sometimes crawled up the masts, and the long, slow way his name has drifted down the centuries and washed up in songs and films you already know. That is the whole journey. You do not have to hold any of it. Just come along as far as you like. So let's start somewhere quieter. Let's start with the sea itself, and with the men who were afraid of it. To understand why sailors needed a devil of their own, you have to understand what it was like to be out there. Not the sea of a holiday photograph, the sea of a wooden ship in the 1700s, at night, 1,000 miles from any land. Picture the ship first. It is small, smaller than you are imagining. A few hundred tons of oak and tar and rope riding on top of a body of water so deep and so dark that no one aboard has any real idea what is beneath the keel. There is no radio. There is no engine. There is no Coast Guard, no rescue, no way to call for help, and no one who could come if you did. If something goes wrong out here, it goes wrong alone. The nearest help is the crew standing next to you, and they are just as frightened as you are, and just as far from home. And below the boards under your feet, there is the water. That is the part that worked on a sailor's mind. Not the storm, exactly, and not the enemy ship on the horizon. The water itself, the sheer depth of it. A sailor spent his whole life floating on the thin skin of something enormous and completely unknown. He could not see into it. He did not know what lived down there. He only knew that it was patient, and that it was always, quietly, waiting. And the sea took men constantly, not dramatically most of the time. A rope snaps in the dark, and a man goes over the side and is simply gone before anyone can turn the ship. A fever runs through the crew below decks. A wave comes over the rail and takes someone standing right beside you, and the space where he stood is just empty now. Death at sea was not rare. It was ordinary. It was part of the weather. And here is the thing that made it different from death on land. When a sailor died out there, he usually got no grave. There was no plot of ground for him, no headstone, no place his mother could ever visit. If he went into the water kept him. The sea does not give bodies back, not usually, and not whole. So a man could vanish completely, with no marker anywhere in the world to say that he had ever existed at all. Think about what that does to the people left standing on the deck. Where do you put a person who is simply gone? How do you hold the fact of them, with no body, no grave, no place anywhere in the world to go and stand? You cannot. Not really. So you need somewhere to put a person who is gone, some idea of where they went. Human beings cannot bear a person simply ceasing, with no address, no destination, nothing. So the sailors did what people have always done with a fear too big to hold. They gave it a shape. They gave the deep a keeper and a name, and a locker where the lost were kept. And they told themselves that the drowned had not vanished into nothing. They had gone somewhere. They had gone down to Davy Jones. So let's follow the paper trail to where it begins, which is a book printed in London in the year 1726. The book has a long, old-fashioned title, the way books did then. It is called The 4 Years' Voyages of Captain George Roberts, and it presents itself as a true account written by the captain himself of a merchant voyage that went badly wrong. For a long time it was read as a real memoir. These days, most scholars think it was a piece of clever fiction dressed up as fact, and they generally attribute it to Daniel Defoe. That is the same Daniel Defoe who gave the world Robinson Crusoe just a few years earlier. Although, honestly, Even that attribution is not certain. Which is fitting. Our very first clue comes to us from a book that might not be by the man whose name is attached to it, about a voyage that might never have happened. Still, the words on the page are real, and they are the earliest we have. Here is the scene. Captain George Roberts is sailing near the Cape Verde Islands, off the coast of West Africa. His ship is taken by pirates. This was the tail end of what people now call the Golden Age of piracy. Blackbeard had been killed only 8 years before, in 1718. The great pirate crews were being hunted down and hanged one by one, but they were still out there, and being captured by them was a real and ordinary danger for a merchant captain. So Roberts is taken, and the pirates fall to arguing about what to do with him and his loyal men, and that is when the phrase appears. One of the pirates, in the middle of the threatening, says he would toss them all into Davy Jones's locker if they crossed him. A little later, the same book speaks of heaving the rest into David Jones's locker. And then, very helpfully for us, sitting almost 300 years downstream, the text pauses and explains what that means. It means the sea. To be put into Davy Jones's locker is to be thrown overboard, into the deep, to drown. So sit with that for a moment, because there is a lot hidden in it. The first thing is that the phrase is already finished. Nobody in the book invents it. Nobody explains where it came from. It is used the way you would use it today, as a thing everyone already knows, a bit of grim shorthand tossed off in the heat of an argument, which tells us the phrase was not born in 1726. It was already old in 1726. It had been in the mouths of sailors long enough to become casual. We are not watching the birth of Davy Jones here. We are just catching the first time somebody wrote him down. The second thing is that little gloss, the moment the book stops to explain that the locker means the sea. Why explain it if everyone knew? Because everyone at sea knew. On land, it was another matter. The people who bought books in London were not sailors. So the author had to translate, the way you might translate a bit of slang from a world you had visited, but your reader had not. That gap is important. Davy Jones belonged to the sea, and the sea had its own language, and that language was only just beginning to leak onto dry land and into print. And the third thing, the small, strange detail that is easy to miss. The name is spelled two ways on nearly the same pages. Davy in one place, David in another. The name was not fixed yet. It was still soft, still settling, still being written down by ear. Davy is just the familiar, worn-down form of David, the way Bill is the worn-down form of William. So even at the very first appearance, we can see the name wearing smooth in real time, sliding from the formal David toward the friendly, frightening little Davy. That would win in the end. But notice what we do not get from Defoe. We get the name and the locker. We do not get the face. There is no description here of what Davy Jones looks like. No horns, no eyes, no smoke. He is only a place to be thrown, a fate, a threat. The monster has a name and an address, but no body yet. For the body, we have to wait 25 more years, and for that, we have to meet the second man. His name was Tobias Smollett, and unlike Defoe, he had actually been to sea. Smollett was a Scot, born near Loch Lomond, trained as a surgeon. As a young man, in his early 20s, he sailed with the Royal Navy as a surgeon's mate. He was aboard for one of the great disasters of the age, the British attack on Cartagena in what is now Colombia, in the year 1741. It was a catastrophe. Thousands of men died, most of them of fever rather than fighting, and the young surgeon's mate saw all of it up close. He saw what the sea and the tropics did to crowded ships full of men. He never forgot the sailors he served with, their speech, their swagger, their superstitions, the whole strange, sealed world of them. Years later, he became a novelist, and he poured all of that memory into his books. And in 1751, he published a big, sprawling comic novel called The Adventures of Peregrine Pickle. One of its characters is a retired naval officer named Commodore Trunnion. He is a wonderful invention, a gruff old sea dog who has come ashore to live in a house he runs like a ship, surrounded by other old sailors still barking orders at the furniture. And at one point, Trunnion describes a terrifying encounter. He swears that he has seen Davy Jones himself, and here, at last, Smollett gives us the face. He knew him, Trunnion says, by his saucer eyes, his 3 rows of teeth, his horns and his tail, and the blue smoke that came pouring out of his nostrils. Read that again slowly, in the dark. Eyes like saucers, 3 rows of teeth, horns, a tail, blue smoke curling from the nose. It is a proper devil. It is the sea's own answer to the fiend with the pitchfork, built plank by plank out of a sailor's nightmares. And then Smollett, speaking as the narrator, tells us what this creature is. Davy Jones, he explains, is the fiend that presides over all the evil spirits of the deep. He is often seen in various shapes, perching among the rigging on the eve of hurricanes, shipwrecks, and other disasters to which a seafaring life is exposed. He is a warning. He is the thing you glimpse in the ropes above you, just before everything goes wrong. To see Davy Jones was to know that death and trouble were already on their way. That is the moment the legend gets its body. Everything that came after, every drawing, every story, every tentacle-faced captain in a film you have seen, grows out of these few lines by a former Navy surgeon remembering the frightened men he once bled and stitched. Defoe gave Davy Jones his name and his locker. Smollett gave him his face. So now we have him. We have his name, from Defoe. We have his face, from Smollett. What we still do not have is where the name came from in the first place. Why Davy? Why Jones? Of all the names in the world, why did the sea's devil end up with the plain, ordinary, almost comical name of a man you might meet at a market? Nobody knows. But people have been guessing for a very long time, and the guesses are stories in their own right. There are 5 of them worth telling. We will take them one at a time, slowly, and I will say this now so you do not have to hold your breath waiting for it. None of them is proven, not one. When we reach the end of the 5, we will not have an answer. We will just have 5 good stories and a shrug. And that is completely all right. Tonight the guessing is the point. So let's start with the most down-to-earth theory of all, the one that says Davy Jones was a real man. In this version, there was once a pub landlord named David Jones, and he kept, in his tavern, a large locker, a cupboard really, or a back room, and into that locker, so the story goes, he would put drunken sailors. To understand why that is sinister and not just untidy, you have to understand something grim about how ships got their crews in those days. Sailing was brutal work, and dangerous, and badly paid, and a great many men did not want to do it. But the Navy and the merchant fleets needed bodies, constantly, more than they could ever get by asking nicely. So they took them. There were press gangs, groups of men who roamed the ports and simply seized able-bodied fellows off the street and carried them aboard a ship whether they liked it or not. And there was a quieter, dirtier version of the same trade, called crimping. A crimp was a man who supplied crews for a fee. He would get a sailor drunk, or drug his drink, and then hand the unconscious man over to a ship that was short of hands and about to sail. The sailor would wake up hours later at sea, already miles from land, with no way back, legally bound to a voyage he never agreed to. Now put David Jones and his locker into that world. In the story, Jones is one of these crimps. He runs a pub near the docks, and he keeps that back locker for the men he has drugged. He stows them there, out of sight, sleeping it off, until a ship comes calling for crew. And then he sells them. So to be put in Davy Jones's locker was to be taken, to disappear from your own life into the belly of a ship. And when sailors later used the phrase to mean disappearing into the sea itself, they were, in this telling, borrowing the name of a real and hated man who had made a living out of making people vanish. It is a good story. You can see why it stuck. It is concrete. It has a building you can picture, a locker you can open, a villain with a face. And it fits so neatly with the real horror of the press gangs that it feels almost too tidy, which is exactly the problem. Because there is no evidence that David Jones the Crimp ever existed. No pub, no record, no court case, no newspaper, no ledger, nothing. Some versions date him to the 16th century, which is 100 years or more before the phrase ever shows up in print, and that is a very long silence for such a memorable man. What the story has is the shape of a folk explanation. It works backward. Somebody heard the phrase, wondered where it came from, and invented a David Jones to fill the gap, the way people have always invented a person to stand behind a puzzling name. It might be true. It probably is not. But it is the first of our 5, and it is the one that keeps its feet most firmly on dry land. So let's leave the pub and go somewhere much older. Because the second theory does not point to a tavern at all. It points to the Bible. In this version, the Jones in Davy Jones is not a surname at all. It is a worn-down, sailor-mouthed version of another name. Jonah. You may know the story of Jonah, but let me tell it the slow way, because it is, at its heart, the oldest sea story there is. Jonah is a prophet. God tells him to go to the great city of Nineveh and warn it. Jonah does not want to, so he runs. He goes down to the port of Joppa, finds a ship bound in the opposite direction toward a place called Tarshish, pays his fare, and goes below to sleep, thinking he can simply sail away from what he has been asked to do. But a great storm comes up. The ship is in danger of breaking apart. The sailors, terrified, throw the cargo overboard to lighten her, and each man cries out to his own God, and still the sea only grows worse, and they begin to suspect that someone aboard has brought this on them. They cast lots to find out who, and the lot falls on Jonah, asleep below, running from his God. Jonah tells them the truth. This storm is because of me. Throw me into the sea, and it will grow calm for you. And at last, when nothing else works, they do. They lift him over the side and drop him into the water, and the storm stops at once. And then, in the part everyone remembers, a great fish comes up and swallows Jonah whole, and he lives inside it in the dark for 3 days and 3 nights, and prays, and at last the fish spits him out alive onto dry land. Think about how much of Davy Jones is already sitting in that ancient story. A man thrown into the sea to save a ship. The deep is a place that swallows a person whole. The connection between one unlucky soul aboard and the storm that threatens everyone. It is all there, thousands of years before any sailor said the name Davy Jones. And sailors kept the heart of it alive in their own language. To this day, a sailor who seems to bring bad luck aboard, whose presence coincides with storms and accidents and fouled voyages, is called a Jonah. It is a real word, still used, still understood. The unlucky man, the one the sea seems to want. So the leap is not hard to make. Jonah, said quickly, over and over, by men who did not read and did not spell, softening on the tongue. becomes Jones. And the drowned man's deep, the place Jonah went, becomes the locker of a figure named for him. A good many people who study words seriously think this is the strongest part of the whole puzzle. That the Jones came from Jonah, the sea's most famous drowning, its most famous survival, and its oldest lesson about who the deep decides to take. Is it proven? No, nothing here is proven. But of all the stories, this is the one that reaches furthest back and rings the deepest. So we have had a pub landlord and a drowned prophet. For the third theory, we have to leave England and the Bible behind and sail west into warm water to the islands of the Caribbean. There is a word used across the Caribbean, in Jamaica and beyond, and it is still alive today. The word is duppy. Sometimes it is written Duffy. A duppy is a ghost, not a gentle one. It is the restless, often malevolent spirit of a dead person, the kind that lingers where it is not wanted and means you harm. The word came across the ocean with the people who were carried there by force in the slave trade, out of West Africa, where the belief and the word both began, and it took root in the islands and stayed, and it is spoken there to this day. Now think about who was sailing those waters. British sailors, constantly. The Caribbean was one of the busiest and richest sea routes in the world in those centuries, thick with merchant ships and navy ships, and of course, pirates. A sailor in that trade would have spent months, years, moving between those islands. He would have heard the local speech. He would have heard the word duppy, and he would have understood exactly what it meant, because a malevolent spirit of the dead is precisely the kind of thing a sailor already believed in. So the theory goes like this. Davy is a worn-down English mouth trying to say duppy, and the Jones, once again, comes from Jonah. Put them together, and you get the ghost of the drowned, the spirit of the deep, carried home in a sailor's ear from the far side of the Atlantic. This idea was written down in a famous old reference book of the late 1800s, a dictionary of phrases and their origins, which linked Davy to that West Indian duppy, or Duffy and Jones to Jonah. So it has been around a long time, and it has a certain pull to it. It is the only theory that explains the Davy part as a word for a spirit, and a spirit is exactly what Davy Jones is. But is it right? We cannot know. The sound change from Duppy to Davy is a real stretch, and the whole thing rests on a Victorian scholar's guess made more than a century after the phrase was already common. It might hold a grain of truth. Sailor language really did soak up words from every port, but it might just be a clever pattern spotted long after the fact. And while we are out here on the water, there is a smaller, related idea worth mentioning, and then setting gently aside. Some say there really was a pirate named David Jones, operating in the Indian Ocean back in the 1630s, and that his cruelty was such that his name became a byword for a watery death. It is a tidy thought, but the Indian Ocean is a long way from the Atlantic world where the phrase actually grew up, and there is nothing solid tying that particular pirate to the legend. It is most likely just a coincidence of a very common name. Jones, after all, is everywhere. Which brings us, actually, to the fourth theory. And this one is the lightest of the five, almost a joke. But sailors did love a grim joke, so it belongs here. In this version, there was a sailor named Jones who was simply hopeless. A duffer. That old word, duffer, means a clumsy, useless, incompetent fellow, the sort who cannot do the simplest thing right. And this Jones, so the story goes, was such a duffer that he was forever falling overboard. Every time you looked, there was Jones in the water again, being hauled back aboard, dripping and cursed at. And so, the idea runs, his name became attached to the act of ending up in the sea. Duffer Jones, softened over time to Davy Jones, the patron fool of going over the side. It is a charming little tale. It is almost certainly not true. It has the unmistakable feel of something invented after the fact to raise a laugh, a story built to fit the name, rather than a name grown out of a story. But it tells you something real about sailors, which is that even their devil had a whiff of dark comedy about him. The sea was too frightening to face entirely straight. Sometimes you had to laugh at it, even while it terrified you. So that is 4. A landlord, a prophet, a ghost, and a fool, which leaves the 5th, and the 5th takes us to Wales. The patron saint of Wales is St David. In the Welsh language, his name is Dewi, Dewi Sant. He has been the great national saint of the Welsh for well over 1,000 years, and every 1st of March, the Welsh still keep his day. Now Wales is a seafaring country, all coastline and harbors, and there were a very great many Welsh sailors crewing the ships of the age. And in Welsh, and in English too, the friendly, familiar form of the name David is Davy. So the thought is this: Welsh sailors, frightened in a storm, might have called out to their own saint for protection, the way sailors of every nation called on the holy names they had grown up with. They might have cried out to Dewi, to David, to Davy, to keep them safe from the deep. And there is another piece that fits almost too well. Jones is one of the most common surnames in all of Wales. So common that Davy Jones is, in a sense, simply the most ordinary Welsh sailor's name imaginable. The everyman of the Welsh fleet. Some of the people who study these things most carefully think the real answer is a marriage of 2 of our theories, that the Davy came from St David, the sailor's saint, and the Jones came from Jonah, the sea's drowned man. A saint and a castaway, fused into one figure by generations of rough voices. It is, if nothing else, the most poetic of the possibilities. The protector and the drowned, wearing the same plain name. And there we run out of theories. 5 of them. A crimp with a locker, a fleeing prophet, a Caribbean ghost, a clumsy sailor, and a Welsh saint. Not one of them can be proved. The honest truth is that the name is probably a tangle of several of these at once, worn together over time until you can no longer see the seams. But here is what I find myself thinking about, lying with all 5 of them. The name won because it sounded right. Davy Jones. It is plain, it is human, it is almost friendly, and that is what makes it frightening. The sea did not take you off to some grand and terrible god with an unpronounceable name. It handed you over to a fellow called Davy Jones, as if death at sea were just an appointment with an ordinary man you would meet soon enough. So we have his name, and his face, and 5 stories about where he came from. Now let's open the locker. Start with the word itself, because it is more ordinary than it sounds. On a ship, a locker is just a chest, a small wooden box or a little compartment where a sailor kept his few belongings, his spare shirt, his knife, a letter from home, if he could read it. Whatever a man owned in the world, he kept it in his locker, and it was one of the only private spaces he had. Every sailor understood exactly what a locker was, because every sailor had one. So Davy Jones's locker is a strangely homely image when you look at it closely. But why a locker, of all the words they might have reached for? Why not a kingdom, or a hall, or a great dark pit? Because a locker was the thing they knew. It is not a hell exactly. It is not a fiery pit. It is a chest. It is the sea's own storage box, where Davy Jones keeps the things he has collected, and the things he collects are men. The drowned are his belongings. He stows them away, down in the dark, the way you would stow a shirt in a box, and there they stay. there is something quietly awful about that. The vast, terrible deep imagined as a tidy container, and the dead as objects put away and kept. And that is what the phrase came to mean, and what it still means. Davy Jones's Locker is the bottom of the sea. It is the grave of every sailor who ever drowned. It is where sunken ships come to rest, and lost cargo, and gold, and bones. To go to Davy Jones's Locker is to die at sea, and go down to the deep and stay there. When a sailor said a man had gone to Davy Jones, everyone understood. He had drowned. The locker had him now. The phrase for the locker specifically, in that exact form, turns up in print a little after Defoe and Smollett. In the early 1800s, a naval publication describes men who would have met a watery grave, or, to use a seaman's own phrase, gone to Davy Jones's Locker. So by around the year 1803, it was settled enough to be quoted as the sailor's standard expression for drowning. From there, it did what good phrases do. It spread. It climbed off the ships and onto the docks, and off the docks and into ordinary speech, and eventually into books and songs, and the mouths of people who had never seen the sea at all. And as it spread, it softened. What began as a real and specific terror slowly became a colorful old saying, the kind of thing you can use lightly now, almost fondly, without any cold water in it at all. But think, for a moment, about what the locker actually is underneath the phrase. Because the real seafloor is stranger and larger than any legend. The deep sea is the biggest single space on our planet, and almost none of it has ever been seen by human eyes. It is cold down there, and utterly black, and the pressure is crushing, and the stillness is complete. And it really is full of the lost. People who study these things estimate that there are something like 3 million shipwrecks scattered across the floors of the world's oceans. 3 million. Every one of them a story that ended badly, and with them, uncountable, are the men who went down with them. So the sailors were not really wrong. There is a place at the bottom of the sea where the drowned and the sunken gather. It is real. They just gave it a keeper and a name. And there is a kind of grim fairness to the locker, too, which the old sailors felt keenly. The sea does not care who you are. Down in Davy Jones's Locker, the admiral lies beside the cabin boy. The rich passenger lies beside the pressed man who never wanted to sail at all. The gold lies in the dark next to the bones, and neither is worth anything to anyone anymore. It is the most democratic grave there is. The deep takes everyone the same way, and keeps them the same way, and asks nothing about rank. For men who spent their lives at the bottom of a brutal hierarchy, there may even have been a strange comfort in that. In the end, the locker made equals of them all. So that is the locker. A chest at the bottom of the world, holding everything the sea has ever taken, in the cold and the dark, forever. Now. If Davy Jones is the keeper of all that, you might start to wonder whether he has a ship, a vessel to gather up the drowned and carry them down. And here the legend of Davy Jones reaches out and takes the hand of another legend, the most famous ghost ship of them all, the Flying Dutchman. The story of the Flying Dutchman grew up in the great age of Dutch sea power in the 16 and 1700s, when the ships of the Netherlands ruled the trade routes to the east. And it goes something like this. There was a Dutch captain. In most tellings, his name is Van der Decken. Hendrik van der Decken, some say. Though like Davy Jones himself, he slips between versions and may never have been a real man at all. He was trying to round the Cape of Good Hope the great stormy corner at the southern tip of Africa, where two oceans meet and the weather can be murderous. A terrible storm came up and drove his ship back again and again, and would not let him pass, and Vanderdecken, in his pride and his fury, refused to give in. He swore a wild and blasphemous oath. He swore that he would round that cape if it took him until Judgment Day itself. He would sail against the storm forever, rather than turn back. And did such a man ever really live? Did any ship truly try that corner and vanish, and any such oath ever get sworn into the wind? Nobody can say. But the story never needed a real captain to feel true, because every sailor who had fought that cape knew exactly how a man could come to swear a thing like that. And something, God or the devil or the sea, took him at his word. He got exactly what he asked for. He was condemned to sail forever, and never to reach port, and never to rest. His ship was doomed to beat against that cape for all eternity, crewed by the dead, appearing out of the weather to other sailors as a warning of the worst kind. Because to see the Flying Dutchman was to know that death was near, just like seeing Davy Jones in the rigging. The two legends rhyme, and sailors felt the rhyme long before anyone wrote it down. The Flying Dutchman came into print in the 1790s in a traveler's account of a voyage, and then storytellers took hold of it. It grew and glowed and gathered detail. The ship shines with an unnatural light. She sails straight into the wind or against the current, which no honest ship can do. Her crew, long dead, sometimes try to hand letters to passing ships, letters addressed to people who died generations ago, and any captain foolish enough to take the mail aboard is doomed himself. In the 1840s, the German composer Richard Wagner made a whole opera out of her, and the image was fixed in the world's imagination, for good. And over time, in the retelling, the drowned keeper and the doomed ship drew closer and closer together until many people came to picture the Flying Dutchman as Davy Jones's own vessel, the ship that gathers the souls of the drowned and carries them down to the locker. That fusion is mostly a modern one, and we will come to how it happened. But the two legends were always sailing the same dark water, and it was only a matter of time before someone put them on the same deck. So let's stay with the Flying Dutchman a little longer, because there is a sighting worth telling, and it is not from a novel. It is from a ship's log, and the man who wrote it down grew up to be a king. The year is 1881. A British warship called the Bacchante is on a long training voyage around the world, and aboard her are two young royal princes, brothers, sent to sea to learn the trade. The elder is Prince Albert Victor, the younger is Prince George, and this George will one day become King George V, ruler of Britain and its empire. So keep that in mind as we go. What follows was recorded by, or on behalf of, a future king of England. In the small hours of the morning, off the coast of Australia, near dawn, something crossed the ship's path, and the account that comes down to us describes it plainly in the flat, careful language of a log. It speaks of a strange red light, as of a phantom ship all aglow, in the midst of which light the masts, spars, and sails of a brig some 200 yards distant stood out in strong relief. 13 people aboard saw it, and then it was gone. When the lookout was sent to the masthead to search for the strange light, there was no vessel to be found, no trace of anything, in any direction. The horizon was empty. That alone would be a good ghost story. But there is a colder note at the end of it. The ordinary seaman who first sighted the strange light, so the account goes, later fell from the rigging to the deck and died. The omen if it was an omen, seemed to keep its old bargain. To see the Flying Dutchman was to see death, and death came. Now, what do we do with a story like that? We hold it gently, the way you hold anything that a serious person wrote down in good faith. Something was seen. 13 people saw a light on the water in the dark before dawn, and one of them would become a king, and he never pretended it had not happened. That much is real. But there is very likely a real thing behind it too, and it is worth knowing because it does not make the story smaller. It makes it stranger. The sea plays tricks with light. In certain conditions, when a layer of warm air sits over cold water, the boundary between them bends light like a lens. Distant ships or coastlines or the tops of waves get lifted up, stretched, doubled, set floating above the horizon where nothing should be. Sailors have a name for it. They call it a fata morgana, after an old enchantress said to conjure castles in the air. A far-off ship, hull below the curve of the world, can be hoisted up by the warped air and made to hang glowing over the sea, upside down or stacked or shimmering, and then, as the air shifts, vanish. Add a little St Elmo's fire, that eerie electrical glow we will come to in a moment, and you have your phantom ship all aglow, exactly as the log describes. So the Flying Dutchman may be, in the end, a mirage with a story wrapped around it. But sit with how remarkable that is. For centuries, the sea itself has been lifting real ships into the air and showing them to frightened men as ghosts. The legend is not a lie told about the sea. It is the sea's own trick, given a captain and a curse. The deep did not need Davy Jones to haunt sailors. It could do it with light and warm air all on its own. So that is where Davy Jones haunts. Now let me tell you the one place where he is still welcomed aboard, on purpose, to this day. There is a ceremony that sailors have kept for hundreds of years, and navies keep it still. It happens when a ship crosses the equator, that invisible line around the middle of the world. Crossing the line, they call it. And it is, in its heart, a piece of theater about entering another kingdom. The idea is that when you cross the equator, you are passing into the realm of the sea itself, into what the old sailors called the royal domain of Neptune. And you do not enter a king's domain without paying your respects to the king. So the crew stages a court. One of the oldest and most experienced sailors dresses as Neptune, the ancient god of the sea, with a beard and a crown and a great three-pronged fork. Beside him sits his queen, Amphitrite, usually a young sailor pressed into the role. There is a royal baby, and a royal barber, and a whole comic court of the deep. And the crew divides into two kinds of men. Those who have crossed the line before are called shellbacks. Trusty shellbacks, members of what is grandly named the Ancient Order of the Deep. And those who have never crossed, the newcomers, the untested, are called pollywogs. Slimy pollywogs, the shellbacks like to say. And the whole ceremony is about turning pollywogs into shellbacks, about being tested by the court of the sea and accepted into its order. So where is Davy Jones in all of this? He has a specific job, and it is a wonderful one. Davy Jones is the messenger. He is the one who comes first. On the night before the ship is due to cross the line, Davy Jones appears on deck, ahead of Neptune himself, bearing a summons. He carries word from His Majesty Neptunus Rex to the ship's captain, announcing that the king of the sea will come aboard the next day to hold his court and judge the pollywogs. And his arrival is meant to be a spectacle. He comes over the bow or up out of a forward hatch in the dark, in the glare of searchlights and the spray of the fire hoses, a figure rising out of the sea onto the deck. Sometimes he stays for the trial itself and helps pass sentence on the trembling newcomers. Think about what has happened to him there. The sea's own devil, the fiend with the saucer eyes and the 3 rows of teeth, the keeper of the drowned, has been given a costume and a walk-on part in a shipboard pantomime. He knocks, more or less politely, and delivers the mail. The most feared figure in the sailor's imagination, softened into a role a man plays in a wig for 1 night a year to frighten the new boys in a way everyone knows is only pretend. And that, honestly, is one of the oldest ways people have of handling their fears. You take the thing that terrifies you, and you dress up as it. You give it a script and a schedule. You make it knock before it enters. You turn the keeper of the drowned into a herald in a costume, and for 1 night, the deep becomes a kingdom with manners, and the terror becomes a tradition, and everybody, even the frightened pollywog, knows it is only a game. The sea does not, of course, but for 1 night you get to pretend that it does. So far, every omen in this story has been a bad one. Davy Jones in the rigging, the phantom ship all aglow, warnings of death and woe. So let me give you the other side of the ledger, because the sea did not only frighten sailors. Now and then, in the worst moment of a storm, it gave them something that looked a great deal like grace. Picture a ship in a thunderstorm at night. The air is thick with electricity, and then, quietly, without a sound at first, the very tips of the ship begin to glow. A soft blue or violet light gathers on the top of each mast, on the ends of the yard arms, on anything that comes to a point. It flickers there, steady and strange, sometimes with a faint hiss or a buzz, like something breathing. It does not burn. It does not spread. It just glows, cold and pale, at the highest points of the ship, while the storm rages all around. So what is it? Where does a cold light like that come from, at the top of a mast, in the worst of the weather? For most of the history of sailing, nobody had the faintest idea. That is St Elmo's fire, and it is completely real. You could see it tonight, in the right storm, from the right hilltop. It is not a spirit and not a flame. It is what happens when the air becomes so heavily charged with electricity in a thunderstorm that the charge begins to stream off any sharp point into the air, glowing as it goes. Scientists call it a corona discharge. The pointed mast concentrates the electric field until the air itself around the tip lights up into a faint plasma. It tends to appear at the height of a storm, and it can even come just before a lightning strike. So it is beautiful and dangerous at the same time, which is very much in keeping with everything else about the sea. But the sailors did not know the physics, and what they saw was a light appearing at the top of their ship in the middle of their terror. And they did not read it as a threat. They read it as protection. They named it after a saint. The name St Elmo comes from St Erasmus of Formia, an early Christian martyr who became the patron saint of sailors. Elmo is just a worn-down, affectionate version of Erasmus, the same way Davy is a worn-down version of David. And when the glow appeared on the masts, sailors believed it was their saint, come to watch over them, a sign that he was present in the storm, and that they would be brought through it. The Portuguese called it Corpo Santo, holy body, and English sailors turned that into the word corpusant, a holy fire at the masthead, the best possible thing to see when the world was ending around you. This is one of the oldest things people have written down about the sea. Long before Davy Jones, the Greeks knew the fire. They noticed that when a single light appeared, it seemed to bring bad luck. But when 2 lights appeared together, it was good. and they gave the pair a pair of names, Castor and Pollux, the twin brothers, protectors of sailors, watching from the mastheads. The Romans wrote about it too. And when Magellan's ships were crossing the world for the first time, in the 1500s, the men aboard saw the fire again and again in the storms off South America, and they wept with relief and took it as a sign that they were watched over and would live. So keep both of these in your mind, side by side, because together they are the whole weather of a sailor's imagination. On one side, Davy Jones, the devil in the rigging, the keeper of the drowned, the phantom ship, the warning of death, and on the other side, the soft holy fire at the masthead, the saint in the storm, the promise that someone was watching, and you might yet come home. The deep had its demon, the storm had its saint, and a sailor lived his whole life somewhere between the two. Which is really the whole point of this next part. Because Davy Jones did not live alone in a sailor's mind. He lived in a crowded world of signs and rules and small, careful rituals. And to understand him, you have to see the company he kept. Sailors were, without much competition, the most superstitious working people who ever lived. And that was not foolishness. It was the natural result of doing a deadly job in the hands of forces no one could predict or control. When your life depends on the wind and the sea and neither one can be reasoned with, you start looking everywhere for signs. You start believing that small acts might tip the odds. It is what people do when the stakes are total and the control is nearly zero. So there were rules for everything. You did not begin a voyage on a Friday, because Friday was an unlucky day. You did not whistle on deck, because whistling was said to call up a wind, and you might call up far more wind than you wanted. Certain words were never spoken aboard. Some crews would not say the word drowned at all. Some would not say pig or rabbit. Bananas in the cargo were thought by some to doom a ship. A woman aboard was widely held to be bad luck, said to anger the sea. And yet, strangely, a carved woman on the bow was thought to calm it, which is one reason so many old ships wore a woman as a figurehead, gazing out at the water to soothe it. And there were things that brought good luck too, small anchors a man could hold on to. A cat aboard was lucky, and earned its keep against the rats besides. Coins were laid beneath the mast when a ship was built, a payment to the sea, a bribe against the deep. When a ship was launched, a bottle was broken across her bow, a habit we still keep without quite remembering why we do it. Sailors covered their skin in tattoos, each one a small charm. A star to find their way home. Words across the knuckles to hold fast to the rigging. And many believed that a caul, the thin membrane a rare baby is born with over its face, would protect its owner from drowning, so cauls were dried and carried and even sold to sailors for good money. And then there was the albatross. Of all the sea's creatures, sailors held that great white bird in a kind of awe. An albatross can glide for days on the wind without ever seeming to beat its wings, following a ship across whole oceans, appearing out of the gray weather far from any land at all. And the sailors believed the bird carried the soul of a dead sailor, one of their own, come back to glide alongside them and watch over the ship. So to see an albatross was a good sign, a friend in the emptiness. And to kill one was close to the worst thing a man could do. It was said to bring a terrible curse down on the whole vessel, to turn the wind against them and the luck sour. And the man who did it would be made, one way or another, to answer for it. That single belief gave the world one of the most famous poems in the English language. In the year 1798, the English poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge published The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, It tells of a sailor who shoots an albatross for no reason at all and dooms his ship for it. The wind dies. The sea seems to rot around them. His shipmates die one by one, and he alone is left alive, becalmed under a burning sky. In the line almost everyone still half remembers, with water, everywhere, and not a single drop to drink. And his punishment is to wear the dead bird hung about his own neck, a weight of guilt he cannot set down. We still use that image today, most of us, without ever thinking of the sea. When something trails a person and weighs on them and will not let them be, we say they have an albatross around their neck. That is a sailor's superstition, more than 200 years old, still hanging quietly in our ordinary speech. There were darker signs too. A shark that took to following a ship for days was watched with real dread, because the old belief held that a shark could somehow sense a death coming aboard and had fallen in behind to wait for it. Every superstition, in the end, pointed back to the same low fear humming under all of them, that the sea was patient, and that it was owed, and that sooner or later it would come to collect. And the name they had given to that quiet, patient collector was Davy Jones. And here is the strangest rule of all, and the one that tells you the most. A great many sailors never learned to swim. Some refused on purpose. Partly it was that they had never had the chance, but partly it was a belief, quiet and fatalistic, that learning to swim only insulted the sea and prolonged the inevitable. If the deep decided to take you, they felt, it would take you, and thrashing about only drew out the ending. Better, they thought, to go down quickly. Better not to keep Davy Jones waiting. And that is the world he ruled. A world where the wind could be whistled up and the sea could be soothed with a carved face, where a light on the mast was a saint and a shape in the rigging was a devil, where a man might carry a scrap of dried skin against drowning and yet refuse to learn to swim. Davy Jones was the largest figure in that crowded sky of belief. He was not a stray superstition. He was the face they had given to the biggest fear of all, the one underneath every other rule, the fear of the water itself and of what it kept. So we have followed Davy Jones all over the sea. Now let's follow him ashore and watch what happened to him once the ships were behind us. Through the whole of the 1800s, the great century of sail and then of whaling, the phrase only grew. English-speaking sailors carried it into every ocean, and from their mouths it kept climbing into books. The sea story was one of the most popular kinds of writing there was in those years, devoured by people on land who would never set foot on a deck, and the sea stories are thick with Davy Jones. Naval officers turned novelists used him. Adventure writers used him. The whole imagination of the sea that the 19th century built for its readers had Davy Jones somewhere down at the bottom of it, holding the drowned. If you grew up reading those books, and a great many people did, you absorbed him without ever being told who he was, which is more or less how he arrived in you. And as the phrase spread, it kept softening. This is what happens to a piece of language over time, especially a frightening one. It wears down, like the name David wore down to Davy. What began as a real and cold expression for drowning slowly turned into a saying you could use lightly. A thing dropped over the side of a boat had gone to Davy Jones's locker. A watch lost off a pier, a set of keys, anything swallowed by water, had gone to Davy Jones. People said it with a smile now, the way you can say a thing is buried 6 feet under without meaning any harm by it. The terror had become an idiom. The devil had become a figure of speech. And he found his way into songs, the way sailors' things always do. Sailors sang constantly, because song is how you coordinate hard work. how you haul a rope together, how you pass a long watch, and their songs and ballads carried the whole world we have been describing. The drowned men, the storms, the deep, and the name of the one who kept them all. Davy Jones drifted through the music of the sea for 2 centuries, half a threat and half an old friend. And then, in a way nobody could have planned, the plainness of his name became part of the story again. Because in the 20th century, there were suddenly too many people named David Jones. In the year 1947, a boy was born in London named David Robert Jones. He grew up to become a musician, one of the most famous and inventive musicians of the entire century. But when he started out, as a young man in the 1960s, he ran into a problem. There was already another David Jones making a name for himself in music, a young English singer who would soon become one of the faces of a wildly popular band. 2 David Joneses could not both rise at once without endless confusion. So the younger one, the one born in 1947, decided he needed a different name to make his own way. He chose Bowie. He took it, the story goes, from the American frontiersman Jim Bowie and the long knife that carries his name, because he liked what it suggested, something that cut both ways. And so David Robert Jones became David Bowie and went on to reinvent himself over and over for the rest of his life, a whole gallery of characters, each one stranger and more brilliant than the last. But sit with the small, quiet joke underneath it. One of the most singular artists of the modern age, a man who spent his career becoming people nobody had ever seen before, began by shedding a name because it was too ordinary to stand out in. David Jones. The very plainness that made Davy Jones such a perfect name for the sea's devil, the everyman quality, the anyone-at-all quality, was the same plainness a young Bowie had to escape to become himself. The name is so common it needed a devil to make it memorable, and so common a genius had to abandon it to be seen. Davy Jones. It really is everywhere. It really does belong to no one and everyone at once, which is exactly why the sea could hand you over to it. So by the middle of the 20th century, Davy Jones had drifted a very long way from that leaking ship near the Cape Verde Islands. He was a saying people used without thinking. He was a figure in old songs. He was a name so common that famous men had to run from it. He had become soft and familiar and mostly harmless, the way an old fear does after enough years pass over it. And then something happened that dragged him back into the dark and made him frightening all over again for a whole new audience that had never seen the sea. Because the movies came for Davy Jones. And when they were done with him, millions of people who had never heard the phrase in their lives suddenly knew his face. Not Smollett's face, with its saucer eyes and its 3 rows of teeth. A new one. A face that would become, for a whole generation, the face of the deep. In the year 2006, a film arrived that a very large part of the world went to see. It was the second of the Pirates of the Caribbean films, and its title was drawn straight from our story, Dead Man's Chest, and its villain was Davy Jones. But he did not look like Smollett's fiend. The people who made the film built him a new face, and it was a strange and memorable one. Instead of horns and 3 rows of teeth, they gave him the head of a sea creature. His beard was a mass of writhing octopus tentacles. One hand was a crab's claw. He dripped and glistened as though he had just been hauled up from the deep, which, in the story, he more or less had. And he was the captain of the Flying Dutchman. So there, on screens all over the world, the 2 legends we have been following were finally welded together into one. Davy Jones and the Flying Dutchman, the keeper and the ship, made into a single thing at last. In the film, Davy Jones sails the Dutchman as a kind of ferryman of the dead, charged with carrying the souls of those who die at sea across to the other side, and the film gave him a reason to be so terrible. In its story, he had once loved the goddess of the sea and been betrayed, and in his grief he had carved out his own heart and locked it away in a chest, the dead man's chest of the title, so that he would never have to feel the pain of it again. A monster made by heartbreak. It is not the old folklore, but it is built on the old bones. And in the film that followed, the audience got to see the locker itself. One of the heroes dies, or as good as dies, and finds himself trapped in Davy Jones's locker, and the film shows it to us as a strange, sunlit, empty purgatory, a place of endless flat water and no escape, where the lost drift with nothing to do and nowhere to go. It is not quite the cold black seafloor of the sailors, but it is the same idea, dressed for the screen. The place you go when the sea has you and will not let you come back. Now, none of that is history. The tentacled face, the carved-out heart, the goddess, all of it was invented for the films. If a sailor from Defoe's day could have seen it, he would not have recognized the creature at all, but he would have recognized the shape of the thing. A monstrous keeper of the deep, a cursed ship crewed by the dead, a locker at the bottom of the world where the drowned are kept. The films took the real old legends, the true folklore we have been tracing all night, and they built something new on top of it. And for millions of people who had never once thought about the origin of the phrase, that new thing became the truth. Say the name Davy Jones today to a great many people, and it is that dripping, tentacled face they see. He turned up in gentler places too. In the cartoon world of SpongeBob SquarePants, down on the seafloor, there is a recurring ghost, the Flying Dutchman himself, green and glowing, and more grumpy than frightening. And the show even reaches for the old joke buried in the phrase. In one running gag, Davy Jones's locker turns out to be, quite literally, the gym locker of a man named Davy Jones, complete with an old sock and a terrible smell, which is exactly the kind of grim little joke the original sailors would have enjoyed, the fearsome name deflated into something ordinary and a bit ridiculous, because Davy Jones, remember, was always both. The devil and the ordinary fellow, the keeper of the drowned and the plain, common name. And the phrase is still with us, out in the ordinary world, doing quiet work. When a ship goes down and cannot be found, people still say she has gone to Davy Jones's locker. Divers say it. Fishermen say it. It turns up in the names of dive shops and seaside bars and boats. It lives on in games about pirates, where players sail digital seas and fear a digital deep. It is still, after almost 300 years, the single most recognized way in the English language to say that something has been lost forever to the sea. Not many phrases last that long. Most sailor slang died with the age of sail. This one crossed over into the modern world intact, carrying its drowned men with it. And here is what strikes me most, lying with the whole long story of it. Every single age has remade his face. Smollett gave him horns and blue smoke. The Victorians turned him into a comfortable saying. The songs made him half a friend. Bowie shed his plain name to escape him. The films gave him tentacles and a broken heart. Each generation reached into the deep and pulled up its own version, and dressed him in the fears and the fashions of its own moment. But the name never changed, and the thing underneath the name never changed either. Underneath every face they ever gave him, it was always the same fear. The water, the depth of it, the not knowing what is down there, and the certainty, quiet and patient, that one day the sea takes everyone, and keeps them, in the dark, at the bottom of the world. So let's come back down. away from the films and the songs and the famous names, back to the men who started all of this, because there is one more thing to show you. And it is the quietest part of the whole story, and it is where the fear and the tenderness finally turn out to be the same thing. We have talked about sailors dying at sea, but we have not talked about what the living actually did when it happened. And it is worth pausing here before we go further, because it explains, better than any theory, why they needed Davy Jones at all. When a sailor died aboard a ship far from home, there was no way to bring the body back. Long voyages could last years, so the sea itself became the grave, and the crew gave their shipmate the only funeral they could. It had its own careful, gentle ritual, and it changed very little across the centuries. The sailmaker, the man whose whole trade was stitching canvas, would sew the dead man into a length of sailcloth or into his own hammock, the same hammock he had slept in every night of the voyage. Round-shot, heavy iron cannonballs were sewn in at his feet to carry him down and keep him down. And there was one last custom, grim and strangely tender at once. The sailmaker was said to pass the final stitch of his needle through the nose of the dead man. Partly it was practical, a last hard check that the man was truly gone and not merely deep in a fever's sleep. And partly it was simply the way it had always been done, the last small act of care one sailor performed for another before letting him go. Then the wrapped body was carried up on deck and laid on a plank at the ship's rail, covered with a flag. The crew gathered. Someone, the captain or an officer, said a few words over him. And then the plank was lifted at one end, and the body slid out from under the flag and down the side of the ship and into the water. There was a sound, and then there was not. The sea closed over him, and in a moment the ship sailed on, and the place was already gone, unmarked, unfindable, somewhere behind them in a wilderness of water that all looked the same. Think about standing at that rail. You have just given your friend to the sea. There is no grave you can ever visit. There is no stone with his name. There is no ground anywhere in the world that holds him. He is simply down there now, somewhere under the keel, in the cold and the dark, and you will sail away and never be able to point to the spot again. And now you can see, I think, what Davy Jones was really for, because a mind cannot hold that. It cannot hold a friend becoming nothing, in no place, with no keeper. So the sailors gave the deep a name and a face and a locker, and in doing so they gave their dead somewhere to be. Your friend has not vanished into nothing. He has gone down to Davy Jones. He is in the locker now with all the others, all the drowned of all the years, gathered together in one place at the bottom of the world. He is kept. He is not alone down there. He has company, and a keeper, and an address. That is not really a story about a devil. That is a story about grief, and about the human need to believe that the people we lose have gone somewhere rather than nowhere. The horns and the smoke and the 3 rows of teeth were the frightening face of it. But underneath the fright, the legend was doing the same work a headstone does, the same work a grave does. It was giving the lost a place so that the living could bear to have lost them. Davy Jones was a kindness the sailors built for themselves, and then, because they were sailors, they made him terrifying, so they would not have to admit how tender he really was. And that is why he has lasted, when almost everything else about that world has gone. We have engines now, and radios, and satellites that can see a single boat from space, and rescue crews who really do come when you call. The sea is far less deadly than it was, but it is exactly as deep as it ever was, and it is exactly as indifferent. It still takes people, every year, quietly, and does not give them back. And when it does, we still reach, without quite meaning to, for the old phrase, "Gone to Davy Jones's locker," because we still need what the sailors needed, somewhere to put the lost. The locker is old, and it is only a story, and it is still, quietly, in use. So let's gather up what we have, gently, the way you would gather shells at the end of a long walk on a beach, not to keep them, just to look at them once more before you put them down. Here is what we actually know, and it is not nothing. We know that by the year 1726, when Defoe, or whoever it truly was, wrote down that threat about tossing men into Davy Jones's locker, the phrase was already old and already understood. We know that 25 years later, in 1751, Tobias Smollett, who had really been to sea and really had seen what the sea did to men, gave the figure his lasting face. The saucer eyes, the 3 rows of teeth, the blue smoke, the fiend perching in the rigging on the eve of disaster. We know that by the early 1800s, the exact phrase, "Gone to Davy Jones's locker," was settled and standard, the seaman's own plain words for drowning. And we know what it means, and have always known. The bottom of the sea, the grave of the drowned, the place the lost are kept. That much is solid ground. You can stand on it. And here is what we do not know, and never will. We do not know where the name came from. We have 5 good guesses, and we have held each one up to the light tonight. There was the pub landlord, David Jones, and his locker full of drugged and stolen men, a story with a building and a villain and no evidence at all. There was Jonah, the fleeing prophet thrown into the storm and swallowed by the deep, the oldest sea story there is, worn on the tongue from Jonah down to Jones. There was the duppy, the restless spirit carried home in a sailor's ear from the warm islands of the Caribbean. There was Duffer Jones, the hopeless sailor forever falling over the side, the sea's own patron fool. And there was St David of Wales, Dewey, the sailor's saint, whose familiar name was Davy, married perhaps to Jonah to make the whole, a landlord, a prophet, a ghost, a fool, and a saint. And not one of them can be proved, and probably several of them are true at once, tangled together past all untangling. And you know what? That is the right ending. I have come to think it could not really end any other way. Because think about what Davy Jones is. He is the face the sailors gave to the deep, and the whole point of the deep, the thing that frightened them most about it, was that it could not be known. You cannot see into it. You cannot map its bottom. You cannot say what lives down there, or what it wants, or when it will decide to take you. It is the great unknown thing the whole world floats on. So there is something exactly right, something almost beautiful, about the fact that the name of its keeper is unknowable too. The origin of Davy Jones is as dark and as deep and as lost as his own locker. The mystery of the name matches the mystery of the sea. You go looking for where he came from, and the trail simply goes down into the water and disappears, which is precisely what he always did to everyone else. The men who knew the answer are not here to tell us. They spoke the name and passed it on, and never wrote down where it began. And then, one by one, over the long centuries, they went down to the locker themselves. The answer is down there with them. It is in the one place none of us can reach, kept by the very figure we are asking about, which is a kind of perfect joke, if you have the taste for a quiet one. The secret of Davy Jones is safe in Davy Jones's locker. And for tonight, that is not a disappointment. It is a relief, because there is nothing here for you to solve. There is no answer you were supposed to arrive at, no fact you needed to hold on to, no test at the end. It is just an old, deep, unanswerable question, the best kind there is to fall asleep beside. You can let it stay open. You can leave it exactly as unfinished as it has been for 300 years, and it will be no more unfinished in the morning than it is right now. Nobody is waiting for you to close it. So let's leave the question open on the water where it belongs, and come back in. Come inward, away from the deep and the ships and the old drowned men, back across all that dark water, towards something much smaller and much closer. Back toward the room you are lying in right now. Actually, before we come all the way in, let me take you on one last short drift outward, because the Flying Dutchman was never alone out there. The sea had a whole fleet of ghost ships, and behind almost every one of them, if you look, there is a real and deadly patch of water that earned the legend honestly. Off the coast of Kent, in England, at the mouth of the Channel, there is a long bank of sand just beneath the surface of the sea. It is called the Goodwin Sands, and sailors gave it a name that tells you everything. They called it the Great Ship Swallower. The sands shift and move, and they lie just where the shipping crowds together, and for centuries they have taken ships by the thousand. A vessel runs aground on them, and the sand does not simply hold her. It works her down, slowly, and closes over her, and swallows her whole, so that in time there is nothing left to see. A killing ground with a mouth, and of course, such a place grew a ghost. The most famous is a ship called the Lady Lovibond. The story says she was wrecked on the Goodwin Sands on the 13th of February in the year 1748. And it was not the weather that killed her, in the tale. It was jealousy. The first mate, a man named John Rivers, was said to be in love with the captain's new bride, a young woman named Annetta, who was aboard on that voyage. And in his madness, Rivers seized the wheel and drove the ship deliberately onto the sands, and everyone aboard was lost, the captain and his bride, and the jealous mate, and all the crew together. And ever since, the legend says, the Lady Lovibond sails again on the Goodwin Sands every 50 years, gliding silently across the very place she died. People claim to see her in 1798, and again in 1848, and again in 1948, right on her cruel schedule. But here is the quiet, honest note, the same note we keep striking all night. When people went looking for the real Lady Lovibond, for the record of her, for any proof that such a ship ever sailed and sank, they could not find her. There is no reliable trace of the story at all before a newspaper article that appeared in the 1920s, which means the ghost may be a great deal younger than the century that supposedly first saw her. She may have been invented, more or less whole, by a writer looking for a good tale to print near Valentine's Day, and then dated backward to make her feel old, which is, when you think about it, exactly what may have happened to Davy Jones himself. Even the ghost ships have uncertain origins. Even the phantoms cannot tell you where they came from. But the sands are real, that much you can be sure of. The Goodwin Sands really have swallowed thousands of ships, and they are still out there, still shifting, still waiting, whatever else is or is not true. And there are other places like them, real places, that earned their reputations in blood. Off the coast of North Carolina, where the warm Gulf Stream runs up against colder water and the sandbars called the Diamond Shoals reach out from Cape Hatteras, there is a stretch of sea that sailors named the Graveyard of the Atlantic. It has taken more than 5,000 ships since Europeans first began keeping count there, 5 centuries ago. 5,000, Think of that. An underwater field crowded with the broken hulls of 5,000 vessels, and all the people who went down with them. Far to the north, in the fog off Nova Scotia, there is a low crescent of sand called Sable Island, wrapped almost always in mist where the cold current meets the warm, and it has its own long roll of the dead, hundreds of ships lured onto it out of the fog across the centuries. These are the real lockers. Not a legend, not a devil, not a story told to frighten a boy on his first voyage. Actual patches of the actual sea where the drowned are gathered in their hundreds and their thousands, lying together in the cold exactly the way the sailors imagined. And this is the thing to hold on to, if you hold on to anything tonight. The sailors were not simply making it up. They dressed the truth in horns and smoke. They gave it a name and a face and a mean streak. But the truth underneath was real. Some water really did kill more than other water. Some places really did swallow ships whole and keep them. The drowned really are down there, in their uncounted thousands, in the dark, right now, as you lie here. And over all of it, across every graveyard and every swallowing sand and every cold shoal in every ocean, the sailors imagined one figure presiding, one keeper with one plain name, keeping the count of the lost. He did not need to be real to be true. The graves were real. He was just the face they put on them, so the graves would feel a little less like nothing. So that is the whole of it. That is as far out as we go. The name, the face, the 5 theories, the locker, the ship, the ceremony, the holy fire, the swallowing sands, and the real drowned lying in the real dark. We have followed Davy Jones as far as he goes, which is to say, all the way to the bottom and out to the edges and back through 300 years. So now, at last, let's come all the way in. Well, almost all the way in. There is one last thing worth knowing, and it is a gift the sailors never got, because they never saw the bottom. They spent their whole lives floating over it, imagining a devil down there in the dark, and they died without ever knowing what was actually beneath them. We know. We have been down. And what is really there turns out to be stranger and quieter than Davy Jones ever was. So what is really down there? Is it the cold, dead, empty nothing the sailors always pictured? Or is it something else entirely? The first thing to say is that the deep is not empty. The sailors pictured it as a void, a nothing, a cold black hole that swallowed men. But it is the largest living space on the whole of the earth, and it is crowded with life all the way down, in places we once thought nothing could survive. And in that total darkness, where no sunlight has ever reached, the animals make their own light. They glow. Soft blue and green sparks, drifting and pulsing in the black, whole living constellations of them, going about their lives in a night that never ends. The deep the sailors feared as pure darkness is, in truth, quietly full of light. And there really are monsters down there. This is the part that would have delighted and terrified an old sailor. In the deep water lives the giant squid, a creature longer than a bus, with arms that trail out into the dark and eyes the size of dinner plates, the largest eyes of any animal that has ever lived, evolved to gather the faintest glimmer in a world with almost none. For centuries, it was known only from the marks it left, from broken pieces washed up, from the scars its suckers cut into the hides of whales. Sailors told stories of a vast tentacled beast that could pull a ship under, and they called it the Kraken, and everyone on land agreed it was a fairy tale. It was not a fairy tale. It was the giant squid, and only in very recent years have we finally managed to film one alive, down in its own dark, moving exactly the way the old stories said. The monster the sailors imagined in the deep was real. It was just waiting, patiently, for us to build a camera that could reach it. And the drowned ships are down there too, of course, just as they always said. We have found them now, one after another, resting on the bottom in the cold and the black. Some of them broken, and some of them almost whole, held almost perfectly by the very darkness and cold that killed their crews. We have sent our lights down and looked at them with our own eyes. The most famous wrecks in history lie down there in the quiet, and we have visited them and come back up and told everyone what the locker really looks like inside. So the sailors were right, in the end, in the way that matters. They imagined the deep as a place of monsters and the drowned dead. And it is a place of monsters and the drowned dead. They just could not have known that the monsters would glow and the dead would lie so still, and the whole vast dark would turn out to be more beautiful and more completely indifferent to us than any legend they ever built to explain it. Davy Jones turned out to be both less than they feared and more. There is no devil down there keeping a locker, but there is a real and enormous dark, full of light and life and the lost, and it really will take everyone in the end, and it really does not care. Which is, if you sit with it, a far larger thing than any devil. So there is nothing to be afraid of tonight. There never really was. There is only the deep, doing what it has always done, far away from you, in the dark, asking nothing. So now, truly, let's come all the way in. So let's come back up, slowly, up from the bottom of the world, up past the glowing things in the dark, up through all that cold black water where the ships lie sleeping, up past the swallowing sands and the phantom vessels and the holy blue fire on the mastheads, up past the crossing line courts with their kings and their heralds, up past the two old writers, Defoe with his threat and Smollett with his fiend, and past the 5 long-dead men who might have lent the name, the landlord and the prophet and the ghost and the fool and the saint. Up through 300 years of sailors passing a name from mouth to mouth in the dark. Up and up until you break the surface, and the sea falls away behind you, and there is only this room, this bed, you. Feel where you are now. Feel the weight of your own body pressing down into the mattress, held, going nowhere. Feel the dark of the room around you, soft and close and safe. There is no deck under you. There is no cold water beneath the boards. There is only the bed and the quiet and the ordinary miracle of being warm and dry and still, a long, long way from any sea. And yet you are not really so far from it as you think, because you carry a small sea inside you, and you always have. The salt in your blood is very close to the salt of the ocean. The tears you cry taste of it. Most of what you are made of is water, warm and moving, carried around inside you in the dark, all night, without your ever having to think about it. You came from the sea, far enough back, all of us did, and you never quite left it behind. You brought a little of it with you, and it is in you right now, rising and falling as you breathe, and listen to that, your own breath, going out and coming back, out and back, like a tide. It has been doing that all your life without needing you to watch it, the same way the real tide goes out and comes back on every shore in the world tonight, whether anyone is standing there or not. You do not have to do anything. You do not have to steer it. It knows the way. It always has. So let it all go now. You do not have to remember any of this. You do not have to keep the dates or the names or which theory was which. You do not have to recall who Defoe was, or what Smollett saw in the rigging, or whether the name came from a saint or a prophet, or a word carried home from warm islands. None of it is yours to hold. It was never a test. Let the whole story slide off you the way water slides off a hull, and sink back down to where it came from, into the dark, where it will keep perfectly well without you. Because it will all still be here. The sea will still be out there in the morning, exactly as deep and exactly as old. The drowned will still lie quiet in their thousands, in the cold, in the real lockers of the real sea, needing nothing from anyone. The Flying Dutchman will still be out beating against the cape in the stories, and Davy Jones will still be keeping his count, and the question of where his name came from will still be open as it has been for 3 centuries, no closer to an answer and no worse for it. None of it needs you awake. None of it needs you at all. It will go on without you, gently, the way it always has, and it will still be here to come back to whenever you like. So there is nothing left to do. There is nowhere you have to be. The tide has you. The bed has you. The warm, small sea inside you rises and falls, and your breath goes out and comes back, out and back, and the room is dark, and you are safe, and the deep is far away and means you no harm. So just rest now. Let it settle. Let the whole long story sink down to the bottom and lie there in the quiet, and let yourself sink with it, softly, into sleep, down past the surface, down past the day, down into the warm dark where nothing is asked of you and nothing is lost. And somewhere far off, on a shore you cannot see, the tide comes in and goes out and comes in again, all night long, keeping no count, waiting for no one, needing nothing, just the water, moving in the dark, and you, drifting, and safe, and already half asleep.